Today we're looking at a new classification system, but this time instead of classifying matter, we're going to be classifying the properties and the observations of those properties for a sample of matter. So properties are things like mass, volume, color, texture, things that we can observe. Observations are the specific data that we're taking about those properties. Observations get classified based on a Q system. We've got quantitative, and we've got qualitative observations. So quantitative observations, qualitative observations really depend on whether or not the observation that you're recording includes a number. And this is the system that people are usually okay with because this is the system that you've learned about before. If your observation includes a quantity or a number, then it is quantitative. If it doesn't, then it would be qualitative. The only exception to this that I have ever been able to think of is, let's say that we labeled this beaker with a 3. And we could say that sample 3 is green. Well, the fact that this has a number, sample 3, does not make our actual observation quantitative because the number doesn't describe the property. When we say sample 3 is green, we're describing the color, and we did not describe the color using the number 3. So again, quantitative contain numbers. Qualitative do not contain numbers. And the only exception is if we are using a number as a label, then it does not automatically make our observation quantitative. Properties are classified in a slightly different format. Properties are classified as being either intensive or extensive. Intensive and extensive are descriptions of the properties, not the specific observations. So if we go back to my example where I said sample 3 is green, what I was describing is the color of sample 3. So color would be the property. The fact that it's green would be the observation. Now, in order to determine whether a property is intensive or extensive, we really need to determine whether or not that property depends on the amount or the quantity of matter within our sample. So I always just say, ask yourself, if I change the amount, does the observation of the property change? You can ask yourself a question like this. If I change the amount, does the observation of the property change? If the answer is yes, that means that it does depend on amount. And if the property depends on amount, that makes it an extensive property. So when you think about color, if I cut this in half, if I poured out half of the liquid in this beaker, the color is still going to be green. It did not change, so that's an intensive property. It's intrinsic to the actual sample of matter, not the size of the sample. However, if I poured half of this out, the volume would go from where it is now, somewhere around 35, down to maybe 30 or 20 or maybe even 15. The amount changed, and therefore the volume changed. Because the volume changed, that makes it an extensive property. So if I'm looking here, we know that something like color would be intensive, whereas something like volume would be extensive. In my picture, I would be able to record the volume, and I would also be able to record the mass. If I poured half of this out, would the mass change? Well, since mass literally measures the amount of substance within a sample, the mass absolutely would change. So mass is also an extensive property. The last thing that we need to include are maybe a third description, which would be for properties like density. Density is a property that we're going to be using in our first big lab. So it's really important that you understand what density is. Density is a property that describes the amount or mass of substance per unit volume. If we look at the mass and the volume of our sample here, the mass of our sample is 36.200 grams. The volume of our sample would be, let's say, 35 milliliters. So the density would be 36.2 divided by 35, 1.03 grams per milliliter. Now I've represented the property of density using a number, so that would be a quantitative observation. The question is it a quantitative observation of an intensive or an extensive property? Well, we know that mass is extensive because if we poured half of this out, it would weigh half as much. We also know that volume is extensive because, again, if we poured half of it out, it would take up half as much room. However, the surprising part to some people is that when you have a property that is a per property, meaning something per something else, it's a ratio. And ratios are actually intensive. Here's why. Let's say we did pour half of this out. So instead of 36.2, now it only weighs 18.1 grams. And instead of 35 milliliters, now it's 17.5 milliliters. By cutting both the top number and the bottom number in half, 18.1 divided by 17.5, that's still 1.03 grams per milliliter. Even though the top number and the bottom number changed, since both of those properties were extensive, the answer did not change because density is actually an intensive property. It does not depend on the amount within the sample. It's intrinsic to that specific type of matter. One thing you need to get in your head is that intensive is not always qualitative. Extensive is not always quantitative. You can take an intensive property, something like density, and you can describe it through a quantitative observation, 1.03 grams per milliliter, but you could also describe it through a qualitative observation, something like saying it's incredibly dense or it's not very dense. It's a description that didn't use numbers. Something like mass, extensive property no matter what, but we can describe the mass using a quantitative number, 36.20 grams, but we could also describe it qualitatively. We could say it's a very small mass, or it's a mass that's less than it was before. You can describe almost any property, regardless of whether it's intensive or extensive, in a manner that uses numbers or doesn't use numbers. What you're going to be asked to do is identify whether specific properties are intensive or extensive, and then also describe whether specific observations of those properties are quantitative or qualitative. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and of course, just continue to communicate.